Hi there folks, I'm Arran Topalian and welcome back to another episode of Game Design Live. For any newcomers, GDL offers you live design deconstructions of a video game as it's played by, well, me, a game designer. So if you're into game design or into a certain game and just want to understand it better on a design level, this is the place to be. And tonight we have the second episode on the Ascent. We covered this last week where I really hadn't played much of the Ascent up until then, and since then I've had a bit more of a chance to get involved with the game and get more stuck into it, and I have a bunch of things I want to call out with you guys and go through. We'll also be touching on some bits and pieces as I play. I'm going to try my best as always to play as well as I can, but no promises. So I'm just going to go ahead and kick off and start. So yeah, like I say, I've been playing an awful lot more for the last sort of week since we last talked about the game in the first episode in the Ascent with GDL, and I've definitely learned quite a lot about the game in terms of its design and maybe some of its pitfalls, but also what it does well. And I've got to say that I'm definitely impressed. Like, I'm a fan. The hype is definitely deserved around the Ascent, not just because of the technical achievements that it showcases, but it's just a great feeling game. It does have some communication issues, without question, which is something that Games Radar, I think their name is Josh West over at Games Radar, wrote a review on the Ascent and gave it 2.5 stars out of 5, which is fair. I'd personally give it a little bit higher, but he does call out, and rightly so, that the game does suffer from some communication issues, which hamper it a little bit. But we're going to have a play around. This is me now a little bit further on. My character has advanced a fair amount since we last played. I don't have a clue where I am in the world. I'm somewhere. And we're going to go ahead and just follow the main story. And as we go, we're going to talk about various bits and pieces. So the first thing we're going to try and cover is... well, this leads us on perfectly to the first thing I want to touch on, really, which is the aim high mechanic in the game. So when I first looked at aim high in the first episode on the Ascent, I kind of felt like it was a mechanic that allowed me to literally just aim higher over objects, and, you know, if enemies were standing at the top of stairs and I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, that would let me kind of get a better angle on them. Since playing a little bit more, I've kind of understood a bit more about what the role of aiming high is. So there's a couple of things. First and foremost, you feel a bit more controlled when you're firing. The game does slow you down. It further pushes the camera along a little bit. I think it kind of like plays with the camera slightly. Like, it kind of moves ever so slightly forward in the direction that you're facing to give you a little bit more forward look. So TLDR, it's almost like you're aiming down the sights in a first-person shooter. That's kind of what I think they've modeled it on. You get a little bit more aim. You have a little bit more control over your aim. You're a little bit less spray and pray, but also, most importantly, and again, the game doesn't tell you this, you're sort of left to figure this out. The stagger, so enemies have what's called the stagger mechanic. We talked about this in the first episode, where you see this bar, this yellow bar beneath their health bar, the health bar being the red bar. This is their stagger bar, and then when enemies are staggered, when the yellow bar is filled, they're staggered and they're stuttered, and they sort of freeze for a second, and you can get some extra hits in before they shoot back. Aiming high and shooting at enemies staggers enemies far more quickly. So you're basically incentivized to aim high whenever you can. And that creates an almost, like I say, COD-style shooter, in the sense that you're kind of flicking up to look down the sights, and then you're aiming back down the sights again, or rather you're letting go of that trigger to enter hip-fire mode again to stay more mobile, which creates quite a nice feeling flow of combat as a result. Like, you feel like you're doing more damage, you feel like you're staggering enemies more. You can see there, for example, this enemy got staggered really quickly. I'm just going to take him down so I don't die. As you can see, I've also had a bit more... I've got access to a few more guns. And the guns are something else we're going to talk about, like the variety of the guns and how they do weapons in the Ascent. Just going to pick this up. Have to wait for that one a little bit. There we go. Cool. Yeah, so as it turns out, the aiming high mechanic is a bit more than it first lends itself to be, or a bit more than it first tells itself to be. And I think part of the problem there is that the game doesn't really teach you how it wants you to play. It's more of a discovery thing, which a lot of the time is an interesting way to go in a game and definitely something you can do. But I feel for the Ascent, it would have been great to get a bit more of a sense of this is how we recommend you play and use aim high. But it works out pretty nicely once you get that feel and creates a bit more of a flow. And yeah, we talked about just a second ago the different weapons that you find in the Ascent. So weapons in the Ascent, in fact, the Ascent in general is essentially not Dark Souls. It's more of like Diablo meets Legend of Zelda. That's the best way I can describe it. So as a shooter, so you've got your sort of papery feeling combat. That's the best way I can describe how it feels. Like you don't feel heavy. Guns don't feel heavy to lift. Your character doesn't feel heavy to move. Much like in Diablo, where everything feels like it's just made of paper. So you've got this one side of it, and obviously being isometric, you've got tons of enemies coming at you that you can just gun down, loads of hordes of mobs. So that's one side of the razor, and the other side of the razor being a term that's quite often used in the industry to describe sort of a... You've probably heard people say this when they're trying to describe a game or a movie to you. You know the saying, it's like X meets Y. That's what's frequently known as a razor, or high concept in the industry. And the razor for this, I would say, is sort of Diablo 3 meets a sort of classic Legend of Zelda. Mainly because of the way they've done their world. So their world is kind of seamless. It's an open world, but it's a seamless world where you're sort of walking around from one end to the other. There are times, of course, where you can take things like taxis and subways to get from one place to another, but it's a very stitched-together world that you just run through. But also, like I say, the weapons in particular are quite Zelda-ish. So when you find weapons, we talked about this a little bit in the first episode on the Ascent, when you find weapons, they create a new weapon slot in your inventory. And you can find these weapons again as you play, and you'll find... So you find dupes, basically, duplicates of this weapon that you can pick up. And usually it tells you how many you're holding. So for example, right now I own 2 Dreads and I own 6 Dominators. I mean, why not? And these are used to basically sell. And money in the Ascent has far more of a role than in Diablo. In Diablo, I think you're typically quite well off. I do want to call out as well, I reference Diablo a lot when I'm talking about this game, and I realized why as I played it more, which is because of the feel of it. It feels very much like Diablo, and because it feels like it's where my head kind of automatically goes. But yeah, so money has a much more of an important role in the Ascent. In Diablo, you're sort of just flush with money, you never really have to worry about it too much. In the Ascent, however, it's the single currency that they have, there's no other currencies in the game, and because of this, there's far more of an onus on it. So earning money becomes a much bigger focus for the player. So selling duplicates of weapons feels a bit more meaningful as a result, which you can then spend on buying new armor or new weapons. So like we were saying, when you find a new weapon, it's added into your sort of roster. You can go ahead and sell the single sort of last one left in your inventory of that weapon. You don't have to keep things if you don't want to. But when I say Zelda, or I compare it to Zelda, I mean, or Dark Souls might be a better reference in the sense that you're finding lots of different weapons, but they all do very different things. And that is kind of how you diversify your build a little bit, maybe compared to another player. And then these weapons you can go ahead and upgrade literally like a sort of Dominator +1, Dominator +2, Dominator +3, and so forth. In fact, I think they actually do have the number there. In the bottom middle of the screen, you can see the Mark 5, MK5. So this weapon is level 5. So there's vertical progression, very straightforward vertical progression to weapons, which you can apply by going to one of the NPCs in the world and spending, I forget the name, weapon points? Basic components? I think they're called basic components when you find them in the map, and that's what you're looking for. And when you find these things, you can spend them on leveling up your weapons. And it works. It's a really nice way to do progression in this kind of game, where you're encouraged to go off and fight enemies and explore to find new weapons that you can change up your build with and find your preferred playstyle. You can really see the difference in stagger there when I raise my gun as opposed to before I did rather. Wow. They do something really nice as well with the UX feedback for when you're firing your gun. I'm going to kill these guys first, then we're going to talk about it so I don't end up being gunned down. So it's a very subtle touch. I didn't really realize they were doing it until quite recently when my partner and I were playing co-op and realized that player 2 doesn't get this. But when you're firing your gun, you get some really nice, satisfying camera shake. It's very subtle, and it seems to switch between 2 axes. So 1 second when you're firing your gun, it's working on almost like sort of like a bottom left to top right, and then it switches to bottom right, top left. So you have a little bit of sort of variety when you're firing your gun. You're getting that camera shake to give you that little bit of extra oomph to signify that your gun is shooting quite powerfully, and it feels good. What's also interesting with that bug I just mentioned, that player 2 doesn't get this, which is strange. So if you're player 2, sucks for you. Well, on co-op at least, on couch co-op, for some reason, player 2 doesn't get this effect. And they also, weirdly enough, don't get a certain layer of sound effect. Like, you tend to find that if you're player 2 couch co-op, not only do you not get screen shake, but also you're missing the sort of layer of sound effects that makes your guns feel more powerful. There's like a base level amount of sound effect that player 2 in couch co-op just doesn't seem to get. But if you're playing single player or you're playing player 1, then you do get that that feedback, that UX feedback from the camera shake, like I say, and the deeper bass, which are very, I imagine, intentional choices on the developer's part. So yeah, we've talked about weapon progression, we've talked a little bit about the razor of the game, the sort of Diablo 3 meets classic Zelda style gameplay, which is a really interesting hybrid. We've talked about the stagger mechanic and the way that the... what is this called, this mechanic? I forget now. Arm raise? Let's call it arm raise mechanic. Aim high? Aim high. The aim high mechanic sort of taps into that stagger mechanic in a way that isn't very obvious at the start. And this does come back to what I want to talk about a bit more with the Ascent, which is that it is an incredible game, both in a gameplay sense and on a technical level. But as I mentioned at the start, and as Josh West mentions in his Games Radar article, that's tough to say really fast. The Ascent does suffer from communication issues from time to time, in terms of basic UX, but also just telling you how to play the game the right way, the way that feels best to play, which we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. I did also mention last time, we talked about the enemy design of the game, and someone in the chat channel asked, what kind of enemy designs does the game offer? Is it sort of along the lines of Diablo 3, or is there anything else more interesting? When I was asked that at the time, I hadn't really played the Ascent all that much, so I'd only seen a limited number of what the enemies were on offer. Having played it more, I'm very happy to say that the Ascent does offer several enemies that tap into what I like to call, I don't know if it's called this anywhere else, but I tend to call it this, which is conducive design. So conducive design basically means that if and when you have a core mechanic, you design things around that core mechanic that tap into that core mechanic. So if you're playing a shooter, or rather if you're designing a shooter, you probably want head damage. Head damage is a good example of conducive design because it taps into the core action the player is doing. It's a way to sort of add more gameplay and more mastery to the thing the player is going to be doing a lot of the time. So it's sort of a natural follow-on from your core mechanic. And that can be applied to anything, whether it's weapon design or enemy design or world design or maneuver design, it can be anything. And with the enemies in the Ascent, you do have enemies that are designed with that in mind. So you've got things, for example, where there's enemies that have shields. So you can't just like sort of fire blindly and mindlessly. There are enemies that require a bit more thinking, especially if you're playing co-op. It's particularly cool where one player is firing at the front and another player can kite behind the back and shoot the enemy in the back, which is pretty cool. We also talked about this reticle the last time, so this white reticle that you're seeing on the laser beam of the weapon. I'm going to touch on that again. The laser beam in co-op can be quite frustrating because it's the same color for every player that's playing, so it's sort of like, you know, like a red laser disco a little bit. Like, it's kind of chaotic. You can't really tell what's going on as a result. There's no way of changing the color either. But yeah, coming back to this reticle, we did talk about this last time and kind of we touched on it on a very high level. I do feel like it's something that maybe the developers could have offered some accessibility options on. It doesn't get in the way, and after a while you almost don't see it, to the point that I don't even know how much it's really kind of needed. And also, like, you have this sort of diegetic feedback, so when you fire your gun, I'm going to try and not shoot an NPC, that just seems mean. And also, we called this out in the first episode, when you fire your gun, NPCs will react to that event. So if I do this, they do run off and panic, which is super cool. But when you fire your gun, the bullets spread anyway. You can actually visually see the bullets spreading anyhow, regardless of the reticle. So you almost have diegetic feedback that doesn't need that extra layer of 2D UX to kind of get in the way. In the first episode of the Ascent, or on the Ascent rather, with GDL, we talked about the fact that the game teaches players how to play through what are called FTUIs. We covered this in the first episode. FTUIs stand for first-time user experiences, and usually they're presented as sort of still pictures on the screen with some text, and they tell you how to play the game. And not every game does this, right? Like Mario 1, for example, taught the player without need of still pictures and text. In fact, at the time it wasn't even a convention. They taught the player through level design and actual play. And with the Ascent, that's kind of how they go about it. And I think there's maybe part of the problem when you first start playing the Ascent is its onboarding experience, what's called the onboarding experience. Again, this is another term that's often used in the industry to describe this first sort of 5-10 minutes. I don't know if you guys can hear that alarm that's going off outside, and if you can, I apologize. Yeah, so the onboarding experience of a game is usually the first sort of 5-10 minutes of the game where the player's taught how to play in one way, shape, or form. And I think that's where the Ascent maybe struggles a little bit, because it's a fantastic game, but it's also a little bit of a late bloomer, where you're not really shown the full experience for quite some time. You're not even allowed to shoot an enemy until sort of like 3 or 5 minutes into the game. When we look at something like Diablo 3, which I said I was going to reference a lot, and I stand by those words, in Diablo 3, the onboarding experience, you're given an enemy to kill in the first 5 seconds, which is very different. You're instantly allowed to get into the action, you're allowed to feel like a hero, you're allowed to start killing stuff and doing things, and you kind of learn an awful lot more through play, which the Ascent, again, doesn't quite offer, which is a shame, because underneath that sort of initial sort of like 15, 20, even 30 minutes, is a really satisfying experience. I have no idea where I'm supposed to be going. Is it here? Am I supposed to talk to someone around here? I mean, if I am, I don't know where they are. Deliver the bag to Taika? Are you Tauka? No? Okay, well, we're going to leave that for now, and we're going to go and do something else, because I've got a clue what's going on there. Let's go ahead and do this. That probably should have been the thing I picked from the start. Let's also see if there's something else I can show off here that I definitely want to talk about at some point. There is, but it's a bit far. That's fine. We are going to talk a little bit about fast travel in the Ascent. So there is fast travel if you just started playing the Ascent and you're not too sure if that's something they offer. They absolutely do. However, it's not really kind of accessed until later on. And they offer it in different ways as well, which is kind of cool. Where am I going? I'm going this way. Whoops. See, onboarding in your game is super important because, you know, it's the first kind of first impressions are important, right? Like, in life and in games. Oh wow, that's level 19? How am I supposed to... Whoa. Oh wow, okay, I don't know if I'm going to be able to go this way. We might have to go a different way entirely. But that's fine, because it's going to bring us on to a different topic that I wanted to touch on, which is respawning in the Ascent. So, respawning is a bit of a weird one in the Ascent. I'm going to hit continue. Actually, that's not bad. Like, surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, given Sod's Law, that worked quite nicely. Normally, in the Ascent, when you respawn, it gets really weird. Like, it picks just sort of a random point that has no kind of marker on it to indicate that that would be a checkpoint, and you sort of have to figure out your way back to wherever you were going. And it would be quite nice, I have to say, if there was some sort of, like a med station or something, like just something to indicate when you come by it, this is the place you're going to respawn from, because a lot of the time when you respawn in the Ascent, it picks some random point, and you're not entirely, it kind of throws you a little bit, and you end up sort of getting a less of a sense of the world, and you just end up following the breadcrumb trail entirely. So having some sort of med base station or something that lit up anytime you walk by them to indicate, hey, this is going to be the respawn point, would be super helpful. And again, I don't want to take away from the game in general. It is a fantastic game. It's great fun to play. It's a technical masterpiece. I hugely recommend you give it a try. Like I say, there are just some communication issues, some UX issues that stop it being a 5-star game as opposed to a 4-star game. We touched on dodging last time in the first episode on the Ascent with GDL as well. We talked about the fact that the player ring, around the player, you can see that the player ring, you've got these chevrons at the front of the ring, and when you dodge, the chevron goes down. So basically these chevrons are used to indicate how many dodges you've got. So it's a nice bit of UX that you don't have to look too far into the corners of the screen to check out. I didn't really touch on, though, why limit dodging. I mean, from a game design standpoint, why would you want to limit dodging at all? Why do this in the first place? Why make a player have to adhere to some sort of limitation? And there's a couple of reasons for this. Two main reasons that I can think off the top of my head, or at least that I would think about if I was designing something like this. The first is that players tend to go for what's called the optimal solution. So players will try to play in a way that makes it most likely that they're going to win. That's what's known as the optimal solution of a game. If you're able to dodge roll all the time, which probably means that you're dodging damage, you're probably going to find yourself dodge rolling all the time because there's no limit. So putting a cap on it basically means that players aren't playing dodge roll the game, basically, which isn't a bad thing, but it can be a little bit sort of immersion breaking. And the second reason is because it makes it a little bit more strategic. So by putting a cap on it, I can't just dodge all the time. I have to think about when I'm going to dodge and why I'm going to dodge. So it's just a little bit more thinking on the player's part to make them feel a little bit smarter, and it creates slightly more strategic gameplay as a result. It's also interesting when you're thinking about dodging, like asking questions like, is my dodge going to allow the player to travel faster through my world? That's another reason why players can be dodged constantly in a game, is because it's actually faster than just running, which Diablo didn't do. The Ascent kind of does. You do move much faster when you roll, but like I say, there is a cap. So that's why we limit dodging. Oh, I'm not going to be able to manage this. Let's just take the fast travel. Yeah, this is just not going to work out. For anyone wondering, there is no punishment for death. There is no sort of like penalization for being killed in the game. It's just, as I say, you're sort of reset back to a certain point, a random point. Hopefully you know where it is, and you're allowed to go from there. So there is fast travel, like I mentioned. You have eventually what's called a taxi system. Money does play into that. So we talked before about the fact that money plays a far more important part in the Ascent, which ties into other parts like weapon dupes and selling items and bits and pieces like that, and money being just a bit more important than in sort of similar games. And in the Ascent, fast traveling also costs money. So you can either choose to hoof it, or you can do this. We should probably check out where we are and where we need to get to. I have no clue. So Arcology High Street, I guess? It's a shame because there is a metro up ahead, which I did want to show off. If we don't get to actually check out a metro in practice, we can always just talk about it without actually getting to the metro station. But I would like to show it because it does something interesting with regard to its fast travel at a metro station. Last time on the first episode of on the Ascent, rather, we talked about ammo in the Ascent. So there is no ammunition in the Ascent, in the sense that there are clips and clip sizes, but there is no ammunition. You don't have to go off and hunt for ammunition. And as much as that's cool, because you're not wasting time looking for ammunition, you're just able to play the game and have a great time. I would have quite liked personally to have had a little bit of an ammunition system. Something even along the lines of Destiny, where you're being given ammunition constantly, you're never actually in need of ammunition, and maybe tapping into sort of like a a basic weapon slash special weapon slash super weapon sort of dynamic, just to make the gunplay that little bit more strategic. As it stands, it's a lot more like Halo, for anyone familiar with Halo, where you're able to carry 2 guns, and you swap between these guns depending on the problem that you're facing. So if you're surrounded by an awful lot of small enemies, maybe you want to take out your splash damage weapon and gun them all down, but if there's a really big, bad enemy in front of you, maybe you want to take out your sniper rifle and deal some massive nuke damage to them. So you're sort of allowed to equip your weapons to handle different sort of combat problems, which do actually vary a little bit more than I first thought when we aired the first episode on the Ascent. In the first episode, we also touched on picking things up in a game, like just picking anything up, like, you know, currency or health, currency in particular, and kind of why that's something that's typically done in a game in general. In fact, rather, we didn't touch on that second question. We touched on the fact that this happens and how the Ascent does it and how it looks and feels quite good, but we didn't really talk about why games typically offer this. Like, why coins in Mario? Why rings in Sonic? Why Ucred in the Ascent? The most important fundamental thing about any game is that it's interactive. That's what separates it from a book, that's what separates it from a movie. It's interactive. It's all about doing something in the thing, pressing a button, moving a stick, and then something happening on the screen. That, at its fundamental level, is the joy of a video game. So whenever you're including things like currency, it's what's known as a passive interaction. And in this instance, it's a frequent passive interaction. It's a way of doing something in the game where you get a little bit of interaction on a micro level that happens frequently. So you're never left for too long without nothing happening at all, which typically leads to boredom. Like, that's kind of the reason why interaction is such a big part of a game experience, because if you're not interacting with it, then it's less of a game, and that's what you signed up for, right? So yeah, a bit of a late bloomer, but like I say, the visuals are stunning. I do think the onboarding, if the onboarding had just been a little bit more tight to really kind of give players a bit more action and gunplay and give them a better sense of how to play, like what's the right kind of way to play with the aim high and with rolling and with moving and with cover, I think that initial first impression would grab people much quicker. But as it stands, it's visually stunning. I think a lot of the time people will give it the benefit of the doubt because it looks so good, and people will hang around long enough to get a sense of all these things that we're discussing. I gotta say as well, like for anyone who owns a PlayStation 5 or has tried a PlayStation 5, I would have personally loved to have seen this on the PlayStation 5 purely because of the adaptive triggers. I think any kind of shooter in general, now that I've experienced it, especially now that I've experienced it, adaptive triggers would have been a fantastic touch to have on a game like this, just to add a little bit more sort of like variety to the feel of the different guns. And maybe at some point down the line, that's going to be a thing that will happen, who knows. I'd also like to quote my partner who called out a really nice sort of way of describing Cyberpunk that I absolutely loved and definitely want to bring up, which is that it almost feels, the entire world almost feels like a Cyberpunk clockwork dollhouse. Like, that's the best way that I think it can be described. Like, everything is always in motion and following sort of set routes, and you're part of that world, but everything is micro. And obviously very cyberpunk, and even the visuals feel like I'm walking through some sort of like high def model, like, you know, like a cyberpunk train set model that is highly interactive. That's almost how it feels. Just the scale of everything, the polish and the proportions of things. Am I going the right way? Yeah, I think I am. What? Oh, okay. Let's just check this out. We are kind of going the right way, but there's no metro. We are going to look at the metro at some point, but I'm going to call it out now before we even see it, and if we get a chance, then we're going to check it out when we actually get to a metro. And it sort of feeds off the back of what I just mentioned with this way of describing the Ascent, which is the sort of cyberpunk clockwork dollhouse, which is that in the Ascent, you can miss the train. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean that literally. You can miss the subway in the game. So you can get to the station and just miss the train pulling out of the station. And if you miss it, you are stuck there until another train pulls in. There's no getting around it. And what's more, Not only that, but if you're in the UI when the train pulls up and you're picking where to go and you don't pick fast enough, the train will leave without you and just shut that menu down. So it really taps into, like I say, this sort of sense of the world is just in constant motion. You know, it's a living world. You're just there and you're part of it, which feels good. We also talked in episode 1 about the fact that civilians... There's no penalty for shooting civilians in this game. Civilians are quite plentiful, but there's no penalty for shooting civilians whatsoever. You're not deducted health, or there's no kind of reputation system whatsoever. But over time, what's really impressive is that you actually find yourself caring about the NPCs anyway, or at least I do. I guess it depends kind of what way inclined you are, and power to you if you don't give a... You know, if you don't care, that's also fine. But I personally found myself caring an awful lot about the NPCs and not wanting to shoot them just because they were NPCs that were innocent. So without any kind of mechanics whatsoever, and that is probably down to the way they react to hostile situations. When you're firing a gun, when there's enemies nearby, they run, they panic, they flinch. If you shove into them or run into them, they get shoved, they get tussled. And that all kind of helps make them feel a lot more alive and a lot more sentient, and as a result, you kind of find yourself caring about them a bit more. That being said, again, to quote my partner, they did bring up a really cool idea that I quite liked, which is it would have been nice to see some sort of mechanic included for not killing NPCs, you know, to be that good guy. Diablo 3 has a fantastic sort of mini-game they do where if you destroy enough static objects quickly enough, you gain a speed buff for a certain amount of time, and the more stuff you smash, the longer that speed buff lasts for. And something like that I think would have been really nice in the Ascent. There's no sprint button, and a lot of the time you really feel the need for one, like just to like hoof it through an environment. You can also roll, but just to be able to click the left stick and just sprint for X amount of time would have felt quite nice. But lacking that, since obviously Diablo doesn't do it either, some sort of mechanic or minigame that allows you to earn a speed buff, aka not shooting civilians for a certain amount of time, I think would have been quite a nice addition. And just add to it. We talked about this before. Players like being given pats on the back for basically anything. The more ways you can find a way to give them a pat on the back, the better, which again Diablo 3 does very well. And in the Ascent, I think there's a couple of missed opportunities to do that. But it could also be because of the style of the game. It's a bit more sort of mature and darker, edgier almost. So perhaps adding lots of mechanics would have felt a bit too gamey as a result, as opposed to more like a cyberpunk sim, albeit isometric. Their build system is also quite interesting. So in Diablo 3 you're offered classes, which help you sort of define your build as you go, right? You start off with picking a very clear choice, so you feel already bonded to that character through picking that class. And then you slowly but surely customize that class by picking different spells and abilities and weapons and whatnot. What on earth is this? Okay, we're gonna have to try and survive this. Where'd it go? So yeah, in Diablo, that's sort of how it works, where you're creating a build through these sort of means. In the Ascent, you're obviously not given any kind of classes whatsoever. You're allowed to design a character, which is definitely a different way of going about creating that bond between player and avatar. But in terms of defining a build, it's actually done through gear, and it's done quite nicely. So you're obviously given different weapons, but you're also given different armor, and armor comes with a bunch of different stats. And not only does it come with a bunch of different stats, but different pieces of armor also tend to rock either attribute buffs or boosts of some sort, which buff other stats. So while maybe something doesn't have quite as high a defense, it maybe gives you buffs in a certain stat or attribute that you're pouring points into as part of the core progression. And it sort of further shapes that build that you're creating and looks maybe more distinct from somebody else's character as a result. So loot, it's loot-driven builds in the Ascent, is what you would call them. Is it just... where is it? Am I missing something? And as you can see, the environments alone are spectacular. Like, the attention to detail, the granularity is just staggering, and it's just constant as well. Every single environment you walk into is, like I say, a very well crafted cyberpunk Warhammer scene where there's, you know, bits of debris and really well painted models and neon lighting. The lighting in general is incredible. Also, for anyone who isn't aware, they recently released a patch where they added ray tracing to the Game Pass version, which is what we're playing right now, which they hadn't done at launch. It was only the Steam version that got that. Am I supposed to do something with like a thing? Do I take this? Do I do something? I feel like I'm supposed to do something. Need to hide our little siphoning operation. I mean, I feel like something should be happening. Okay. Maybe if I quit and come back in? Where's the spider? We had this massive enemy at the start, and it's just disappeared. I'm starting to think this is a bug. Oh, do I go through here? Nope. Okay, let's quit the main menu and come back. We'll be right back after this brief interlude. Let's try that again. Unfortunately, it does suffer from a few bugs, which is a shame. I've mostly experienced them in co-op, where elevators don't quite work correctly, and player 2 tends to get the rough end of the stick with some other strange bugs like we talked about earlier. But by and large, single player has not been too bad, he says. Okay. It's good to see you again, Black Ice. Welcome back. We've touched on quite a lot so far, but be sure to check out the VOD when it comes out. We've touched on things like weapon progression. We've touched on things like UX. We've touched on things like onboarding. But we're going to talk about a fair few more things while we're here. If I can manage not to die. Oh, wow. Another way that players tend to find sort of diversification between builds is the augmentations of the game, which are actually really cool and offer some fantastic abilities. So the one you just saw there is, I think it's called Lock-On, where I hit a button and then I fire pretty much continuously with higher damage and perfect aim for, I think it's like 3 seconds or 5 seconds, and it feels awesome to use. It's sort of signified by a purple cone that's coming out of me. I'm just going to try it again and see if I can do it. Hang on. Oh, wow. This thing. There we go. Oh, wow. Okay, try that again. So yeah, build diversification is sort of achieved through loot diversity, but also through the augmentations that you take, because it's quite a smart move in the sense that obviously with different players you have different playstyles, and with different playstyles, if they're supported, come different builds. So when you're playing with somebody else or alongside somebody else, as you get further into the game, you do find your builds slowly starting to separate, and you feel a bit more distinct as a result, despite the fact that you're picking up the same stuff. And that's something else I want to touch on actually while I'm trying not to die in this fight, which is that the Ascent doesn't offer instanced loot. So instanced loot is essentially where each player is given their own loot to pick up. So the dice is rolling for each individual player. In the Ascent, however, when something drops, it drops for every player involved, which is a slightly different approach. So, you know, if, for example, the Dominator machine gun drops, and I pick it up, both me and anyone else playing with me is going to be given the Ascent that I just picked up. And that goes out for money as well. But it is worth calling out that, I need to come up with a term for it to try and better describe it, but it is worth calling out that with money goes into one pot and then comes out two, if that makes sense. So if I pick up 50 U creds, we both get 50 U creds, and we can spend those 50 U creds however we want. We're not kind of spending money out of the same pot, so to speak. Oh, wow. We're going to go ahead and use this weapon. Oh, God. Oh, okay, that's not the weapon I thought it was. There are some weird bugs sometimes with the weapons that you have equipped seem to sort of like randomly change themselves. Oh, come on. Wow. Oh, we can't do that again. There can't be two.
That was refreshing. You should stand down, Indent. We don't want to disintegrate you just yet. Were you trying to create a supernova just now? Because that's what your uninformed meddling with the Taurus containment field would have led to. That your stack boss asked you to do this only confirms his incompetence. Luckily, we are in control now. This tokamak is
I have to say that the cutscenes in this game are incredible. I'm going to be quiet while this plays out.
Registered there, including yourself. Your indentured contracts have been transferred and renewed in accordance with existing agreements and standard protocol, etc., etc. In short, you belong to us for what remains of your pitiful life expectancy. However, while you have demonstrated an alarming lack of cognitive skills, you have also shown an aptitude for applying lethal solutions to conflicted situations. This might be of some use to Y-Corp. So, we wish to test your abilities by giving you a special assignment. A trial of sorts. Success will raise you above the filthy mass of regular indents and provide you with certain perks. And you'll be given a chance at earning your freedom. We will set up an operations center in Cluster 13. Come find us there.
Okay, I have to say that now the story is starting to grab me. Now I feel invested in what's going on. And this taps into what we talked about earlier. I feel the onboarding of the Ascent is just a little bit too long. If I'd been shown this just a bit quicker, if I got into that a bit faster, I really would have been far more invested in the game from the get-go. As it stands, up until now, I really haven't been following the story at all, which might be me as a player type, or it might be the storytelling in general. The world itself has been fascinating, but you know, I haven't been listening too much to the dialogue that's been going on. But yeah, the cutscenes, as I was going to say before I rudely interrupted you guys watching the cutscenes in particular are fantastic. They're shot really well, they're voice acted well. But I do find that when you're accepting quests in the world, they can be a little bit info dumpy. You're given an awful lot of information that's just sort of poured onto you. And I haven't personally found myself overly invested in the dialogue that's been getting offered. But the writing, especially in the cutscenes, is superb, and I'm sure that if you're not me and you do take the time to actually, you know, listen to the dialogue that's being given to you, it's probably as good as you're saying Black Ice as well, if not better. It's most likely just me as a player. Cool. Okay. I also did figure out, we talked about this in the first episode, and I figured out finally what the UX behind the press and hold versus press is when you're given these prompts to open chests. So basically, if you're shown an open command or whatever it is, and the square behind the button isn't red already, it's a press and hold. If it is red, it's a press. It's not the most intuitive, but eventually it comes to you.
Waiting. Message from sender Kira. Stored and awaiting playback.
You did. We're waiting for you. Don't test our patience.
I would have really loved as well to have seen a version of the Ascent that just felt a little bit heavier. Like when we were talking earlier about the feel of this game, and the fact that it's part of the reason why I referenced Diablo 3 so much when playing it, is because it feels like Diablo, but with a gun, in the sense that it feels like it's made of paper. Everything feels fairly weightless. Your aiming feels weightless, the guns feel kind of weightless, despite the heaviness of the models that are used in the world. The combat itself and the movement feels quite light. Which is very in keeping with Diablo. And I would have personally really been interested in seeing a version of the game where everything felt just a little bit heavier, where maybe it was a little bit more Gears of War style, and you know, you felt the slam of yourself as you locked into cover, or you felt the heft of the gun as you raise it with the left trigger. Just to bring you ever so slightly more into what is an incredibly designed world. think we're going the right way. Something else I'd like to touch on as well is what's called the importance of anticipation and progression. So whenever you're playing a game, you're typically aiming towards some sort of goal, whether it's the completion of objective, but also normally the acquisition of new items, of new loot, of some new sort of form of power. Diablo 3 does this quite well because what they do is they surface all the powers to a player from the get-go. You can instantly check out all the things you're going to unlock in terms of abilities and spells and whatever else. And it's something to look forward to. It's a driver to keep playing. I really shouldn't. Did I just shoot NPCs? I feel so bad. And in the Ascent, they do it slightly differently. So because of the way their progression works, where it's more like Legend of Zelda. Speaking of which as well, I want to touch on that as something of a tangent. So in as much as the Ascent offers its progression in a more Legend of Zelda or Dark Souls type of scenario where you're finding new loot that offers new types of gameplay and in turn potentially new builds, you're also not quite benefiting from, I think, the same sort of level of celebration that games like Legend of Zelda do offer when it comes to finding new stuff like that. Saying that Dark Souls doesn't offer it either, and it worked quite nicely, so maybe it's not even needed at all. Am I going the right way? Yes. So this is what we talked about before when it comes to leveling up weapons. So these are basic components. When you first start playing, the game doesn't really explicitly tell you that this is what they're for, but basic components allow you to upgrade your weapons vertically. So in gaming terminology, you have two types of progression in the game. You have what's called vertical progression and horizontal progression. Vertical progression relates to when something becomes a +1 of itself. So to use this game as an example, you're looking at something like the Dominator, and you can see there in the bottom, well, let's look at the middle of the screen first. You can see there it says Mark 5. If you look to the middle bottom of the screen there, it says Dominator Mark 5, because I've leveled this weapon up 5 times. So basically it's Dominator +5, so it does more damage, it has better stats, and I do this by spending basic components at a shop to level it up. In other games, you get what's called horizontal progression. And horizontal progression is essentially where you're expanding the options that you have as a player. So in the Ascent, an example of that would be finding a new weapon entirely, right? So this is horizontal progression, where you've got something like the Pacifier, the Superior, the Astro Smasher, and so on. In Hearthstone, it's getting new cards. In Minecraft, it's getting new tools. This is what we mean by horizontal versus vertical progression. These kind of fights as well you really don't get into until a bit later in the game, where you really start getting swarmed by hordes of enemies and you really tap into that horde combat gameplay, which is inherently really satisfying. Just gunning down tons of enemies and having a blast doing it. It takes a little while for the game to warm up. It's a late bloomer. Nothing wrong with being a late bloomer. Unless you're a gamer. As always, if anyone's interested in any particular areas of the game they'd like me to discuss in a bit more detail, then please do shout out in the chat. I'm more than welcome to change track, otherwise I will just keep talking at you. So here we really see kind of like the aim high mechanic in play. So we talked before about the fact that the game doesn't really kind of help elaborate on how you should use aim high. It gives you a couple of examples almost of how to use aim high, which are almost the simplest and least interesting aspects of the mechanic. What's particularly cool is, like I say, using it almost like aiming down the sights of a gun in COD, where you move slower but you do gain a bit more accuracy, and in the Ascent at least you deal way more stagger damage. So you are very much rewarded for moving more slowly. And it also just feels good. It does feel like playing a first person when you're swapping in and out of looking down the sights. Which also helps the game feel a little bit less mindless. Like rather than just sort of like point, shoot, you have this sort of switching in and out of two different modes. So the combat feels a little bit more dynamic as a result. You can see the differences here. So if I just bring this guy down a little bit, I'm going to shoot him without arms high, and I'm going to kill him. Just take my word for it, okay? I promise. That is how it works. As for the weapon design as well, I've been really impressed so far. We've found a few to call out. There are a couple of machine guns, like your classic sort of machine gun boys, which you gotta have, right? Then you've got your classic sort of shotguns. You've got this thing, which is just exceptional to look at. It just looks cool, right? Like you want to use this straight up. You also have some pistols, which I haven't really seen the benefit of. You do get some weapons that are kind of like hits and misses. I don't fully understand why they'd be used. To take Halo as an example again, every weapon in Halo has some sort of clear pro and con, whereas a lot of these just seem to have a lot of cons and not very much pros. So it could be these are just things to fill in the gaps between finding better items, or it could be down to some design issues. But some of them are very fun. You also have things like a sniper rifle, a grenade launcher, energy shotguns. There's quite a wide variety of weapons at your disposal really to try out. So as always, if you've been enjoying the content, if you enjoy listening to me talk for an hour on end, fantastic. Please do follow. Sign up for more of listening to me talk for an hour on end or so about design stuff. That would be great. I'd really like that. Give the channel a follow. You can also check out my Twitter, which is @AHTopalian, where I tend to tweet an awful lot of game-related news and gaming articles or things related to design psychology, which I try to stay very well informed in, given that it's my job. And I like to stay well informed. Plus it's interesting, right? It's game design. It's super cool and fun. What could be better? Black Ice, I have actually. I've been planning on that for a while. I've actually downloaded all of the VODs that I have so far, and I'm planning on making a migration over to YouTube with those VODs very soon. So great minds. Stay tuned. As I mentioned on my Twitter as well, in case anyone's missed it, I will be doing... We're now at 31 followers, which is incredible. It's been 2 weeks the channel's been running for, which is really just super heartwarming and very kind of motivating to keep making more content. I am planning on a sort of special thanks celebration with doing a special bonus episode, like an extra third episode during that week on Overwatch, if and when the channel hits 50 followers. So at 50 followers, we're going to be doing a special bonus episode on Overwatch, where I'm not going to be playing because, I mean, I do like to sort of pretend I'm good at Overwatch, but I'm not really that great at Overwatch. Don't tell anyone. So instead, my partner, who is an Overwatch pro, they don't like to admit it, but they absolutely are, will be playing in my stead while I'm talking about the various aspects of the game and the game's design. It's an incredibly designed game, so I think it'll be a nice opportunity to do that. But like I say, if we hit 50 followers, that bonus episode will be happening. Okay, looking good. I called that out before, but I'm going to call it out again. The camera shake they do in this game is so satisfying. Like I said before, I didn't even realize it was something they were doing until we realized in co-op that player 2 doesn't get camera shake. And that typically is a sign of good camera shake in your game. If you're looking to do camera shake, it should be almost something the player doesn't notice. In fact, some people even say the art of good game design is making your design invisible, to the point that players don't even notice it. If they're not even calling it out, it's obviously something that feels good. And with the camera shake in the Ascent, I would definitely say it's one of those scenarios where you really don't notice it until you've noticed it, in which case that's all you see. But yeah, the camera shake when you're firing your gun, ever so slight, but it's got kind of like a chutter Is that a word? It's probably not a word, but that's the word that I want to say. It's got kind of like a chudder to it. And it feels very satisfying and heavy as a result. Hashtag chudder. Something else Diablo 3 does, which I find very satisfying, and I kind of again wish that the Ascent had tapped into, is the aspect or the concept of multi-kill rewards. Like when you're killing tons of enemies at the same time, especially if it's something that was an NPC, wasn't it? Oh, I'm so sorry, dude. It's something that Diablo 3 does quite well, where if you're lining up a bunch of enemies into a little group or something, or you're kiting them into a group and then bam, you kill them all at once. In Diablo 3, they celebrate you for that. They give you a sort of on-screen UX, UI prompt telling you multi-kill, and you get some sort of buff as a result. I think it's an XP buff. And a little something like that can go a long way and make you feel just a bit more badass. Or however it is you like to feel. Just to call this out as well, so I've come past this way a couple of times now, and every single time I do, I like to stop and look at it for a second because, you know, it looks fantastic. But also there is a reason in game design why you create scenarios like this, or scenes like this with sort of architecture like this, I guess you'd call it. Disney World uses them an awful lot in their theme parks. They're called weenies. Not wieners, weenies. Big difference. And weenies essentially are large, very kind of standout structures that people can see from a long way away, and it allows them to form a sort of mental map in their head as to where they are. It becomes a sort of a landmark icon where you can sort of associate a particular point in the map with that object. So here, for example, this is very close to one of the elevators in the game that takes you to the hub. The elevator is literally right over there. So whenever I'm coming this way and I see this thing, it's a clever way of kind of slowly educating me about the layout of the world through weenies. So there you go. I'm going to try and find a metro stop for you folks, just real quick. We're going to get back to the hub, and I'm going to see if I can find a metro hub, because I want to show off this missing the train thing, because it's just fantastic. On the one hand, I can't believe they did it. On the other hand, I'm kind of pleased they did. But yeah, Cyberpunk Clockwork Dollhouse just, I think, sums up the aesthetic and feel of the game pretty perfectly. Your avatar almost looks like a little figurine. Let's see if there's one nearby. There is a metro. Is that what we're after? Have I been that lucky? If you can't hear me, it's if you can hear clicking, that's my thumb frantically tapping the dodge roll button. Okay, a little bit further. The fact the world even gives you little sort of signposts like this is a really nice touch. Like, again, it's not something they had to do, but it's very immersive. Like, the game is actually telling us here, through a diegetic bit of information, metro this way. They've even got road signs. Okay, great. Here's the metro. Am I going to catch the train just in time? I am. And look at that, the train just pulled in. Perfect timing to wrap up the episode and to fast travel somewhere. Let's just check this out though. Yeah, like I said before, if you don't pick somewhere just in time, you know, because you're taking your time, you're deciding where to go, bam, missed the train. Look at that. Another day. This has been GDL on the Ascent. This has been the second episode. It's the final episode on the Ascent. Thank you very much for coming along and listening to me. There will be a VOD on the channel as well if you fancy checking out what we talked about at the start of the episode, which covered quite a broad range of subjects. And as I mentioned, Black Ice, I will be putting this onto YouTube as well, so stay tuned for that. The next episode will be this Wednesday, same time, same place, 9 till 10 p.m. BST. We'll be looking at the first episode on Death's Door, which is an isometric hack-and-slash game that recently came out. I'm looking forward to chatting a bit about that in more detail. Thank you very much again for tuning in. This has been Arran Topalian. Thank you and have a great evening.